Something's happening in Washington that honestly shocked me when I first started digging into it. And it's not the usual back and forth you'd expect. For the first time in years, we're seeing Republicans, Trump's own party, actually pushing back. Not just complaining behind closed doors or leaking to reporters, I'm talking about real legislative action to limit presidential power. And the reaction? Let's just say it hasn't been calm. Look, I know we're all exhausted by political drama. But this is different. This isn't about tweets or sound bites. This is about whether our system of checks and balances actually works when it's tested from the inside. So stick with me here, because what's unfolding could change how presidential power works for decades. Picture this. Late night in D.C., senators are getting notifications on their phones. Staffers are triple-checking what they're reading because it seems almost surreal. The president is livid, but not at Democrats, not at the media, at his own party members. And here's the thing, rebellions don't usually come from inside your own camp. When they do, that's when things get real. Right now, we're watching Senate Republicans join Democrats to rein in Trump's authority. This isn't your typical partisan squabble. These are members of his own party saying, "Hold on, we need to pump the brakes here." Now, why does this matter? Because some Trump supporters are genuinely frustrated. They were promised no new wars. They're dealing with a cost of living that keeps climbing. And some of those big transparency promises? Still waiting on those. But the deeper issue is this. Republican lawmakers themselves are starting to question the concentration of power they're witnessing. And when that happens, when the people inside the system start activating those checks and balances we learned about in civics class, presidents don't usually respond with, "Hey, great point, let's discuss this." They escalate. They create urgency. They declare emergencies. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Let me give you a concrete example that really illustrates what's going on. Senator Chris Murphy laid this out pretty bluntly, and it's kind of jaw-dropping when you think about it. There's been talk, actual talk from the administration about Greenland. Now I know that sounds bizarre, but stay with me. Greenland isn't just some unclaimed ice sheet. It's part of Denmark. Denmark is in NATO. And NATO's whole thing is collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. So when you start floating the idea of military action toward territory belonging to a NATO ally, you're not just being provocative. You're potentially putting us in conflict with our closest allies in Europe. And the fact that senators are having to explain this publicly, that tells you how far outside normal boundaries this conversation has drifted. Nobody voted for a presidency that risks tensions with our allies over territorial ambitions. Yet here we are with lawmakers from both parties trying to close that door before it gets kicked wide open. Here's what I think is really driving this. Trump doesn't see foreign policy through the lens of alliances or treaties. He sees it like real estate, like a deal you can force if you apply enough pressure. That might work in business negotiations. In global politics, it's dangerous. And Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president frames military action as on the table, things start moving whether Congress approves or not. That's why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battleground. When Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting unilateral military action, Trump's response wasn't to negotiate or persuade. It was anger. Reports say he made calls to senators, including Susan Collins, that weren't exactly cordial. And look, I get it. Nobody likes being told no, especially when you're used to getting your way. But that phone call wasn't just about one vote. It was about the realization that even within your own party, there are lines people won't cross. For Trump, that's existential. His whole strategy depends on projecting strength and control, and nothing undermines that faster than your own party publicly voting against you, especially on issues of war and constitutional authority. So what happens when faced with pushback? He doesn't retreat. He reframes. Enter the emergency declarations. Trump recently declared a national emergency related to Venezuelan oil assets. Now, on the surface, you could argue there's a strategic element there. But look closer and you'll see the pattern. Emergencies let you centralize power. They let you bypass normal debate. They shift the conversation away from uncomfortable questions. And there are definitely uncomfortable questions right now. Why have certain transparency initiatives stalled? Why have promised document releases been delayed? Why did it take bipartisan congressional pressure to move things forward instead of executive initiative? Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has been pretty vocal about Inspector General compliance issues and missed deadlines. That's not accusatory. It's just pointing out that the process seems broken. And that's what Trump can't afford right now, because his approach depends on keeping everything moving so fast that accountability can't keep up. Here's the thing. These storylines aren't separate. The Republican revolt, the war powers debate, the emergency declarations, the stalled transparency efforts, they're all connected. It's a presidency trying to stay ahead of accountability by accelerating chaos. And Republicans who used to wave everything through are now doing the math. They're weighing institutional damage against party loyalty. They're realizing that if they don't act now, they might not recognize the system later. Because once a president suggests he's guided only by his own judgment, not by law, not by treaties, not by precedent, it stops being a partisan issue. It becomes a structural one. That's the moment we're in. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves, is stopping this betrayal or is it preservation? History doesn't care who had the best zingers on social media. It remembers who stepped up when the rules were bending past their breaking point. And this revolt, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive, might be the first real sign that those internal guardrails are being tested. Not by the opposition, but by people who understand exactly how dangerous unchecked power becomes when it's wrapped in grievance and permanent emergency rhetoric. Let me dig into what's happening behind the scenes because that's where this gets really interesting. When that war powers resolution advanced with Republican support, it wasn't random. It was calculated. Senators understand that if the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it fights back. And that fear isn't ideological. It's constitutional. The War Powers Act exists for exactly this kind of moment, when a president's instincts outpace the system's safeguards. And Trump's reaction, the profanity, the intimidation, the threats of political destruction, only reinforced concerns that decisions are being driven more by impulse and grievance than by careful strategy. Legacy is a big word here. Trump's obsessed with how he'll be remembered. He wants to be seen as dominant, transformative, historically significant. But that's increasingly colliding with reality. The promise of no new wars rings hollow when military rhetoric is being casually thrown around. And wars aren't abstract to voters. They're costs, they're risks, they're consequences. Republicans facing re-election understand that no amount of branding sells a conflict with allies as a win. That's why the turn toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic. Emergencies let you bypass debate, marginalize opposition, and frame anyone who disagrees as working against national security. This isn't new. Leaders throughout history have reached for emergency powers when they feel their authority slipping. In Trump's case, the Venezuelan oil emergency is textbook. Economic assets get reframed as security imperatives, even when the actual benefits are distant, uncertain, and mostly corporate. Because it's not about the oil. It's about optics and narrative control. And lawmakers see right through it. They recognize it as a strategic distraction from congressional oversight, internal party dissent, and growing scrutiny of whether the administration follows through on promises. Here's where Trump's relationship with his own party gets complicated. He doesn't just want support, he demands total submission. When senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than normal governance. He publicly threatens their careers, while privately depending on their votes for judges, legislation, and political cover. That contradiction reveals how fragile his position actually is. Power based on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. We're watching that happen in real time. Republican senators are quietly coordinating, comparing notes, deciding when and how to draw lines that used to be unthinkable. And this calculation comes from a real concern. Trump's rhetoric about law and authority isn't just symbolic anymore. It's operational. When a president suggests he's governed by personal judgment rather than international law or constitutional limits, it signals a worldview where rules only matter when convenient. That terrifies lawmakers who understand that precedent outlasts any single presidency. If these norms collapse now, they won't magically reappear later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints and policy disagreements into existential tests. And it's all happening while the public struggles to separate spectacle from substance. That confusion isn't accidental, it's strategic. In a chaotic information environment, those who thrive on chaos benefit most. Trump's always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability. That's why these converging stories matter. The war powers fight, the emergency declarations, the Republican revolt, the stalled disclosures, they're not isolated. They're stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. Republicans who once rationalized everything as temporary are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction is a form of consent. That realization has shifted the conversation from loyalty to triage. They're no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They're asking how to prevent irreversible damage to institutions they still need after he's gone. And that shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. It's driven not by ideology, but by alarm. By lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs. And once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without cost. That's the cost Republicans are now trying to avoid, even as Trump escalates and frames every check on his power as an attack on the nation itself. Because in his mind, the two are the same. And that belief is what's finally pushed his own party into open resistance. Now, while the public argument rages over war powers and emergencies, there's quieter pressure building underneath. Every time the administration escalates crisis language, it inadvertently highlights what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, accountability. This is where things get procedural, not conspiratorial, just uncomfortable. When lawmakers ask why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch indefinitely, why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they're not alleging wrongdoing. They're identifying red flags. And red flags are dangerous because they invite scrutiny. Scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed and spectacle struggles to manage. The discussion around delayed document releases has become sensitive because the administration itself made these a defining promise. They signaled urgency and transparency, but reality has unfolded much slower than the rhetoric suggested. When senators like Sheldon Whitehouse start publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, using numbers, timelines, compliance requirements, it reframes the whole issue. It stops being a political talking point and becomes an administrative credibility test. Credibility is the currency of governance. Once it's questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. The request for Inspector General review isn't an accusation. It's an admission that something in the process went wrong, whether through mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities. For an administration already battling internal revolt, that kind of inquiry compounds the pressure. Because inspectors general operate outside political theater, they deal in memos, records, chains of decision-making, and their work doesn't vanish with a tweet. This is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer, not in any single statement but in the pattern. Whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens. Emergencies get declared. External threats get emphasized. The conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. It's instinctive. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes. But Congress isn't an audience. It's a co-equal branch. And some lawmakers are starting to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, following financial trails, asking why certain avenues weren't pursued proactively if transparency was really the priority. This isn't about proving an outcome, it's about explaining a process. And processes have records. Records are stubborn. They don't care how loudly anyone insists on their version of events. The deeper this goes, the more it threatens Trump's preferred mode of operation. personal control over narrative rather than institutional disclosure. That collision is what he fears. It limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. This fear explains why rhetoric around loyalty has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, why even bipartisan oversight gets portrayed as partisan warfare. Because once you accept neutral review, you accept outcomes you can't control. And Trump has always treated control as survival. This brings us back to why Republicans are so uneasy. They see everything converging at once: war powers challenged, emergency powers scrutinized, disclosure processes questioned, internal unity fraying. They understand this isn't just a bad news cycle, it's a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top. Some Republicans are quietly acknowledging that the real risk isn't what investigators might find. It's what happens if oversight fails entirely. A system that can't examine itself becomes brittle. And brittle systems don't bend, they shatter. This awareness has shifted the internal conversation from defense to distance, as lawmakers calculate how to separate their constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that treats those responsibilities as obstacles. Meanwhile, Trump continues pushing forward, framing himself as besieged and unfairly constrained, leaning harder into personal destiny language. But the institutional machinery around him hums louder, slower, more deliberately. Because oversight doesn't rush, it accumulates. And that accumulation keeps him up at night. Because no matter how many crises are declared or enemies named, paper trails don't vanish. Deadlines don't forget. Processes don't care about loyalty. That's why this moment feels heavier. It's no longer about what Trump says. It's about what he can't fully control. For a leader whose authority has always flowed from dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force yet. So here's where we land. This isn't about a single vote or phone call or emergency declaration. It's a reckoning that can't be postponed. What we're watching isn't just personality clashes or outrage cycles. It's a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office. This moment feels different because the resistance isn't purely partisan. It's institutional. It's procedural. It's driven by lawmakers who may disagree on everything else, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth: power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, defended through intimidation, eventually it turns against the system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans know this, even if they won't all say it out loud. They understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. And once those precedents exist, they don't belong to one person or one party. They belong to whoever comes next. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes cast not for applause, but for restraint. Oversight requests framed as necessities, not attacks. Distance created not from disloyalty, but from self-preservation. Because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. Trump senses this shift. That's why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down. They accelerate. They raise stakes. They demand loyalty tests. They insist only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. That paradox is at the center of this presidency's current chapter. A leader obsessed with legacy, but increasingly boxed in by process. A party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. And institutions forced to choose whether they'll be performative or functional when it matters most. For those watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another episode in a long-running political drama. But that misses the point entirely. The real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. And that question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to all of us. Voters, citizens, anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. As this continues, as oversight grinds forward, as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, The outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands. Not in theory, in practice. Because systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, normalized, until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming from within. From Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far isn't betrayal. It's responsibility. Whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency, but the rules every future president inherits. That's why this moment matters, why it deserves attention beyond outrage, why it demands engagement and conversation. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. That defense, quiet or loud, is the real story behind the headlines. One that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits. And the world is watching to see whether those limits still mean something. Good evening. This is a special report from the Capitol. I'm your host, bringing you the latest updates directly from the studio.